Good morning. It is Wednesday, January 15th. The multi-front war in the Middle East is now 467 days old. I'm your host, Mariam Wahba, a research analyst here at FDD, filling in for Jon Schanzer. Welcome back to the FDD Morning Brief. Ceasefire talks dominate the headlines this morning as Qatar says a deal is at its closest point. Meanwhile, an Egyptian official noted that a final outline has been approved by both Hamas and Israel. I, for one, am holding my breath. Secretary Blinken yesterday disclosed that Hamas has recruited almost as many terrorists as it has lost in the war. This is reportedly happening under the leadership of Yahya Sinwar's younger brother, Mohammed Sinwar, who came to power in October of last year after the IDF took out Yahya Sinwar. Mohammed is not yet a designated U.S. terrorist. The key word here is yet. Now, a bit about today's guest. I'm excited to be joined by Middle East scholar and author Sam Tadros. Sam and I share an interest in the goings-on in Egypt in particular. Sam has had several distinguished roles, previously serving as a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute and a professor at Johns Hopkins University. Sam also co-hosted Sam and Amar, a TV show on Al Hurra TV that is credited for producing the first long-form historical documentation of the Holocaust in Arabic. He's also the author of 2 books, both of which I highly recommend, and I look forward to diving into a conversation with him in just a few minutes right here on the FDD Morning Brief. Now, keeping on with the theme of Egypt, let's break down a developing story. If you've been casually tracking the Arab world's most populous country, you'd know that Cairo has a few spinning plates at the moment. First, Egypt is playing a primary role in the hostage and ceasefire negotiations, and this isn't Egypt's first rodeo either. In fact, Egypt was once seen as the negotiator between the Palestinians and the Israelis. What's the difference this time, you ask? Well, a couple of things. First, Qatar's diplomacy efforts in the hostage negotiations have received significantly more media attention this time around, which has often made it seem like Cairo's in the back seat. Second, and more importantly, Israel's war on Hamas has become a domestic issue for Cairo, making anti-Israel and anti-American sentiments particularly high right now. Beyond the war, Egypt officials are finding themselves managing yet one crisis after the other. The latest of these crises involve an Egyptian national and former HTS member of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, by the name of Ahmed Hamad al-Mansour. Up until just a few weeks ago, al-Mansour was a card-carrying member of the Islamist HTS before he announced his resignation on X. Very Gen Z, I know. Since then, he has taken to social media to incite violence against the Egyptian president Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, and rumors last night circulated that HTS actually arrested al-Mansour in Syria at the request of the Egyptians. In the background is Cairo's looming economic crisis. For decades now, Egypt's economy has largely struggled. Russia's invasion of Ukraine made things even more difficult, as most of Egypt's grain imports have come from the 2 European countries. Egypt also relies on a lot of tourism from both Russians and Ukrainians. The Houthi attacks in the Red Sea compounded this strain, costing Egypt over $7 billion in Suez Canal revenue since the attacks began more than 11 months ago. We'll hear more about this and more from our guest in a few minutes. But first, here are your headlines. Headline number 1. The Houthis fired a ballistic missile at central Israel overnight on Monday. I know, another day, another attack. This time, the Iran-backed rebels launched a missile shortly after 3 a.m. on Tuesday morning, triggering sirens across Israel. Israeli air defenses intercepted the missile, but a fragment crashed into a home just outside of Jerusalem. The homeowners were out for a stroll and returned to find a ballistic missile chunk lodged on the roof. Imagine that. This was the second Houthi attack in just under 12 hours. The Israel Defense Forces shot down another Houthi ballistic missile around 6:30 p.m. on Monday evening. The Houthis claim the attack targeted a vital site in Tel Aviv. Neither missile caused direct injuries. However, Israeli emergency services said 11 people were wounded while running for cover. Headline number 2. Israel's National Security Council exposed an Iranian plot to lure an Israeli businessman to Dubai. Here's the scoop. An Israeli man recently alerted the Security Council that an individual posing as an employee of a Persian language news channel contacted him on Telegram to request that he fly out to Dubai for an interview about the Iranian regime. The Israelis smelled something fishy, and boy, was he right. Turns out the contact was a hacker who had infected the man's cell phone with malware. Yesterday, Israel's National Security Council issued a statement warning Israelis to be vigilant online and when they travel. Iranian agents are attempting to contact Israelis and convince them to travel abroad under false pretexts. Last month, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps reportedly sought to lure an Iranian-Israeli journalist to Turkey, where the regime planned to kidnap him and smuggle him back to Iran. Thankfully, the plot fell through when an intermediary failed to participate. Headline number 3. Israeli ambassador to the United Nations, Danny Danon, warned that the UN Security Council that Hezbollah is an ongoing threat. Hezbollah may have suffered serious blows over the last several months, but the group is not giving up just yet. Danny told the Security Council that Iran is helping its Lebanese proxy regroup and rearm, and that it remains imperative for the international community to focus on curbing the flow of materiel to Hezbollah. Since the ceasefire in Lebanon took hold, there have been multiple attempts to transfer cash and weapons to the terrorist organization. Danny noted that the buildup is happening right under the nose of the UN peacekeeper. Shocking, I know. The United Nations Interim Forces in Lebanon, or UNIFIL, has long turned a blind eye to Hezbollah's entrenchment in the South Lebanon, which violates UN Security Council 1701. Well, UNIFIL continues to flout its mandate, and Israel worries that the peacekeeping forces have not learned their lesson just yet. And now it's finally time for that interview with Sam Tadros, a Middle East expert and a true scholar in every sense. I am pleased to welcome him to the show right now. Welcome to the program, Sam.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Well, let's dive right in. First question for you. As you know, after October 7th, Cairo has tried to position itself as a regional power broker, as we've seen itself involved in the ceasefire and hostage negotiations. But domestically, it's dealing with some serious economic and political challenges. Can you paint us a picture here, broad strokes? What is Egypt dealing with domestically?
Definitely. And both these issues are deeply tied, as you pointed out. The attempt to present Egypt as a broker is an attempt to attract attention in order for foreign powers to address or help Egypt address its economic problems. As we've seen the pouring of money from Gulf countries, from the West, the United States, or the IMF and World Bank, in order to help Egypt because of the conditions in the region and Egypt's role in that. Egypt is dealing with a lot of problems, largely by its own making, in a sense. Economically, the Egyptian pound is facing tremendous pressure. We've seen a lot of devaluations in recent years. Over a period of 10 years, it's basically gone from 7 Egyptian pounds to the dollar to 50 Egyptian pounds today to the dollar. And this has created, obviously, a huge inflation in the country. Everything is expensive. People can't afford the things they used to afford in the past. We've seen a lot of complaints about these economic conditions. Obviously, Egypt has also lost a lot of its foreign currency income, whether it comes from tourism, because of the impact of the regional war going on the Egyptian tourism industry, as well as the Houthi attacks, as you alluded in your introduction to the situation of Egypt. All of these economic conditions are serious and have really pressured the regime tremendously. The regime is also, in a sense, still dealing with the basic question that has been shaping Egyptian politics since the regime came to power, removed the Muslim Brotherhood, and Sisi assumed power. And that's what kind of political equilibrium, formula, balance can be maintained in the country. We've had repression, we've had releasing some Brotherhood guys recently, but we still haven't reached this point of balance where the regime has an actual policy of how to manage the political forum or the public space in the country.
Yeah, I think we're in violent agreement on that end. And you spoke a little bit about how exactly the economy has deteriorated. And it's really the elephant in the room in my eyes. But can you flesh it out a little bit more for us? Why exactly is I mean, it's an obvious question, but how did we get here? How did Egypt get to this point economically? And what are some of the repercussions when you look at the Egyptian population, the growing Egyptian population, um, from this economic fallout?
Yeah. No, definitely. I mean, there are two sides of this question. Basically, there are the fundamental issues that have not changed in the past number of decades. So Sisi is not responsible for these. He inherited these conditions, low productivity level of the workforce, for example, the level of educational system that does not produce the kind of caliber and qualities required, skills that are required for a globalized economy. So there are these issues there that have always been in shaping Egypt's economic conditions. Although one would say that the last decade under the Mubarak regime, things significantly improved. Egypt was doing a lot. I mean, economic growth indicators were really high. But the current crisis is also of Sisi's making. He's a man who's possessed or obsessed with the idea of grandiosity and his place in history and Egypt's place. And to be fair, it's not easy ruling Egypt. It's not easy taking the place of where Ramses II or the great pharaohs sat and then achieving basically nothing. People in Egypt have a natural expectation of their leaders to make Egypt great again, to borrow from the American the slogan or debate. So he's been obsessed with these mega projects, a new Suez Canal that was actually not needed in the first place, a new capital that no one is living in at the moment, all these big projects, and pushing the military to engage in them and finish them as quickly as possible have led to tremendous borrowing from abroad. And the result is that the debts that Egypt has basically accumulated over these years is tremendous, and payments over these debts has basically placed huge pressure on the Egyptian currency as the government becomes basically the biggest buyer of foreign currency in the black market in Egypt, increasing the prices because of its high demand in order to pay its foreign debts.
I'll foot stamp your point in particular about it's not easy to rule Egypt. My mind goes back to this famous Mubarak interview clip where he talks to the Egyptian people very frankly, colloquially, and he says, you don't like when I rule this way, you don't like when I rule that way. Like, it's not easy ruling Egyptians. But I want to shift a little bit to President Sisi. You did mention that last year was a decade since he came to power. This year we're coming up on 11 years since Sisi came to power following the events of the Arab Spring. And in that time, Washington has largely, with a few exceptions here and there, continued military aid to Egypt, despite concerns about human rights, governance issues. How would you assess the Biden administration's success, or lack thereof, of balancing American security interests with a pressure to reform the Egyptian state? And how might you anticipate that the incoming administration might shift gears from Biden's strategy?
You pointed to the problems. Obviously, we have strategic interests with Egypt. We have a long relationship with the military that you want to maintain, cooperation over regional issues. Although one will highlight that Egypt's importance in the region has greatly diminished from when that relationship was founded between the US and Egypt. On the other hand, you have a regime that not because just we care about these issues, but for its own good, should pay attention to some of the political questions and human rights and not necessarily a democratic system, but having an open enough and half-open society that allows at least some steam to come out instead of reaching the boiling point and having a revolution again. So the US is struggling to deal with these issues. And I think the Biden administration comes to power and they think they're going to be different. President Trump embraced Sisi. They're going to pressure the regime. There are several voices in Congress on the Democratic side who've been pushing in that direction. And Biden comes with that idea. And surprise, surprise, they end up basically in the same situation that every other administration has been in, and that's having to deal with Egypt and maintaining the relationship and ignoring all these questions that concern the US about Egypt's domestic conditions. So they come with very high rhetoric about human rights and that. Candidate Biden even tweets about Egypt's human rights condition during the campaign, but then there's nothing at all.
Right.
So I think whether you like their policy or their initial plans or you didn't, the end result is they did nothing about it. The administration's policy towards Egypt is a complete failure. There's no actual policy. We're dealing with the situations as they come along. The Trump administration comes, and obviously this is welcomed a lot in Egypt. The regime feels much more confident that Trump is a friend of Egypt, that the relationship will become deeper. Trump called Sisi his favorite dictator. So, well, they have high expectations. This, of course, will be balanced by an administration that's not high on engaging in the Middle East in the first place and wants to limit that kind of U.S. engagement. So I think the Trump administration comes with a much better embrace by the Egyptians, but at the end of the day faces the same questions of how do you deal with this troublesome, I don't want to call it an ally, a client ally/ally basically in the region that you support very generously economically, but that you have deep problems with the way that it governs internally, basically.
Right. And I think anybody who's been observing the Trump 0.2 foreign policy mindset will accurately say that there's kind of been this transition to more transactionality. There's the incoming president is calling people into account. And I think it's going to be very interesting to see how that plays out with Trump, as he put it, his favorite dictator. Shifting gears yet again, I want to ask you about the Israel-Egypt relations in light of the October 7th war. What do you make of where things stand right now? And I'm not going to ask you to read the tea leaves too much here, but what does the day after relationship between Cairo and Jerusalem look like when all is said and done?
I think there was a deep sense of disappointment in Israel as to Egypt's reaction after the 7th of October. The peace between the two countries had always been cold. But under President Sisi, and largely because of Egypt's internal needs, there's been a much more warming of the relationship between the two countries. Because you had the Islamic State in Sinai, because you had the terrorist threat that basically the Egyptian state had no capability in handling in the first place, there was much more intelligence cooperation with Israel. The Israeli military was conducting airstrikes on behalf of the Egyptian regime inside the Sinai to kill these ISIS terrorists. So there was, in a sense, a much more deepening relationship. And during the past, much smaller, obviously, episodes of conflict between Israel and Hamas during Sisi's reign, there has been basically an Egyptian attitude of let Hamas pay the price. This is not just because of this deepening relationship with Israel, but also because of Egypt's own attitude towards Hamas as the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood and the regime's own trouble and fight with the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood inside the country. This changes dramatically, and the Israelis are, in a sense, caught off guard. They don't understand why Egypt has been very different this time. Egypt has really been embracing the Palestinian cause 100%. The regime has encouraged popular expression of support to the Palestinians. I mean, this is Egypt. You don't get protests in the street that just happen randomly because people want to protest things. When there's a protest against Israel, it's basically organized, controlled completely by the Egyptian security forces and allowed for their own reasons. So you got all these moves. The Egyptian clash with Israel over the question of control of the corridors or the movement between points of entry and out between Gaza and Egypt, all these questions. I think the attitude in Israel, while in a sense appreciating an Egyptian role in the hostage negotiations, at the same time, I think once the war ends and the dust settles, there's going to be some assessment in Israel about the Egypt relationship and where it can move forward. So I think the day after holds important questions to Israel about how to manage, again, this oldest peace treaty that Israel has in the entire region, and yet a partner who's not really a partner in the most critical situations.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Sam, for that analysis. Please check out Sam's work, and thank you again for joining us today on the FDD Morning Brief.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Here's what FDD has on tap for you today. Check out my colleague David May's compelling article in the Jerusalem Strategic Tribune, in which he exposes the illegal and perverse lawfare campaign being waged against individual Israeli soldiers. David underscores the incoming Trump administration that must take a firm stand against these campaigns and calls for the imposition of sanctions on ICC court officials. Be sure to tune in today onto today's live-streamed event at 11 a.m. Eastern, featuring a conversation with U.S. Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency Director Jen Easterly. The discussion will cover America's cybersecurity vulnerabilities, the evolution of public-private cyber collaboration, and how the agency she's led can play a role in enhancing national cyber resilience amid growing threats from U.S. adversaries. The conversation will be moderated by my colleague, Rear Admiral Mark Montgomery. Visit fdd.org/events or the FDD Events podcast to catch the conversation. Finally, FDD has released its latest major report today entitled Biotech Battlefield. FDD China Program Director Craig Singleton's new monograph examines how the Chinese Communist Party is exploiting biotech technology as a strategic tool for power projection. He outlines the grave risks posed by biotech firms linked to Chinese military and offers a clear recommendation for how Washington can more proactively head off and counter these threats. And that is it for today. If you're looking for more analysis on a variety of topics related to foreign policy and national security, check out our website, fdd.org. Be sure to check out our quick takes on X at FDD and check out our Instagram and YouTube channels, and consider making a tax-deductible donation at fdd.org/invest. Tune in Friday for another episode of the FDD Morning Brief, guest hosted by FDD Senior Fellow and former IDF International Spokesperson, Jonathan Conricus. Be sure to check out that episode. Thanks again for letting me host today. I'm Mariam Wahba, signing off for FDD.